picture of Alec Murdaugh there that we loaded to start the segment. So we are going to get into some Murdaugh news. There was a good bit of that this past week that we want to talk about. But before we get to that, several big stories that we've been covering over the past week. Alec Murdaugh there that we loaded to start the segment. Chief among them, sorry folks, chief among them, the story out of Charleston, South Carolina involving the Boeing whistleblower, the alleged suicide. Jen Wood, you've been following this story from the beginning. Walk us through the very latest in the Boeing whistleblower case.
Well, so I won't go too much into the backstory, but John Barnett was well known throughout the aerospace industry as a major player and in the whistleblower world, and he had been raising the alarm regarding Boeing's safety and quality at their factories, and he was found dead in the middle of his deposition in his whistleblower case in Charleston. I believe it was March 8th.
March 9, morning of March 9.
Thank you. And the second that it was announced that he had been found dead, I mean, immediately everybody was like, there's no way that this is, death by suicide. You have to look into this. So, sure enough, we got FOIAs out. We started getting reports back. This week, we got the 911 call back along with the CAD report, which is the dispatch report showing, when everybody was dispatched, when the call came in. So yeah, we do still have some more outstanding FOIAs, but yeah, that case continues to, the more information comes out, I keep looking for something to, give me some solid information saying that, this was suicide. I haven't seen anything quite yet.
Well, and obviously we got two things. We've got the crime, and then we've got the context in which it occurred.
Right.
But since we don't know a lot about the crime, why don't we talk a little bit about the context? And I think we've got a couple folks that have weighed in with some questions. One of the questions, are there any other big names involved that we don't know about? Well, we do know one big name. The CEO of Boeing, in the aftermath of all this, has announced he is stepping down at the end of the year. Also, the Boeing board chairman has announced that he will not be seeking another term. So there are some big names involved who are stepping down as a result of this. But Jen, another one of our commenters has raised the question of basically asking about former President Trump rolling back some industry safeguards, basically allowing the airline to inspect itself. That's something that has obviously continued in the Biden administration. Multiple administrations really have given Boeing a lot of leeway and latitude when it comes to their regulatory processes. And this is an example, I think, of a culture. And you wrote a great story about this, Jen, talking about the culture at Boeing and how it changed back in the late 90s when the company merged with McDonnell Douglas. Give us a little insight into that, Jen.
So I believe it was 1997, Boeing merged with McDonnell Douglas, which is another major aerospace company. And, the merger was big news. And the two companies, it was intended where Boeing was going to take over McDonnell Douglas. And Boeing has, been around since, the birth of the aerospace industry. It's known for their safety and quality. They had a heavy focus on engineering and engineering good products. And when they merged with McDonnell Douglas, the McDonnell Douglas culture kind of took over, and McDonnell Douglas was more focused on, the business side of things, the finance, making money. So the shift away from the engineering aspect and the quality aspect began in 1997, actually.
Well, I wanted to read a comment here real quick. This is from Just Call Me Ava. I like that. I've got a daughter named Ava. But and Ava wrote, Boeing decided that it was more important to keep their shareholders happy and began cutting corners. Who cares about safety? It's only a mass transportation vehicle they produce. What could possibly go wrong? She goes on to say, this is the typical CEO mentality these days. Let's cut costs to the freaking core while raising our income levels to ensure we can afford that second or third yacht. Now, we hear criticism like this a lot of corporate America. Jen, in this case, hitting the mark, isn't it?
Right. I mean, one of the really interesting examples that because I watched a lot of Boeing documentaries about, what has happened over the years, because it is fascinating. One of the really interesting examples that John Barnett gave in one of his interviews was that, he was a quality manager, and his job was to inspect the work of people as they were producing these giant planes intended to carry hundreds of people. And when he started, he said, there was one quality manager checking 15 people's work. And by the time he retired in Charleston, there was one for every 50. And I mean, that's an important role. You're checking to make sure everything is, I mean, if you look at a plane, all these little parts that go into it, I mean, you're checking every aspect of the manufacturing process of that plane.
Yeah, and John Barnett, obviously, if you follow FITSNews for years, FITSNews, unlike a lot of the mainstream media in South Carolina, we've been very critical of Boeing. This is a company that South Carolina taxpayers shelled out $1 billion to come to the Palmetto State based on a number of different promises. Not all of them have come true, by the way, but this is a company that, again, vital role in America's aerospace industry, and yet they continue to drop the ball. Obviously, the 737 MAX is the one we all know the most about, given the two horrific crashes that 346 people back in 2019. That led to a global grounding of that plane. But also the 787 Dreamliner, the one that's made in Charleston. John Barnett was very aggressive in exposing some of the manufacturing issues that were taking place at the North Charleston facility with regard to the 787 as well. And in fact, one of the quotes that really stood out in my mind, we cited his work repeatedly in our coverage, but he talked about how this isn't a problem with an individual plane, it's a culture problem. Jen, before we move on from Boeing, there is one thing I wanted to let you know. They're getting ready to launch their first manned space capsule this coming month, or actually I believe it's in May. And they had a press conference just this week where the commander of that voyage said to the media, "Don't expect perfection." Well, I don't know about you, Jen. I'm not climbing on any Boeing space capsule anytime soon, but
No, I'm not entirely. I had this discussion with my husband the other day. I asked him if he would get on a Boeing plane right now, and he said, "Well, yeah." And I said, "Well, I'm not entirely sure that I would." And he said, "Well, statistically, you're fine."
Well, why don't you book the tickets for your family there, Jen? I would book them.
Hard pass.
I trust you booking those, not your husband. At any rate, we're going to get back. Katie Kane had a wonderful question about the scene of the crime, asking about how did the woman who called in 911 know about the firearm if she hadn't approached the vehicle? That's a very good question. We're assuming she was probably told about that. That 911 call, again, we published it just this past week. We're still waiting on a ton of information. Another Tesla Models Plaid, that's a great screen name, I like that, asked if there was any GSR. We don't know the answer to that question yet. So one person asked, how do we know it was loaded? I would argue that the gunshot wound to John Barnett's head is probably a good indication of that. But certainly all the details about that crime scene, we're still waiting on information. Jen, you've done a great job submitting FOIAs. So keep us up to speed on that, and obviously we will continue to shine a light on the Boeing culture and the issues that may have led to the suicide or alleged suicide of whistleblower John Barnett. Jen, another company we've been covering, and we're not going to spend a ton of time on this. If you're outside of South Carolina, the name Blackbaud may not mean a lot to you, unless, of course, you're in the nonprofit business, work at a university, maybe work at a hospital and use their software. But this is a company that employs about 3,000 folks worldwide, including 1,000 here in South Carolina. It moved to the Palmetto State back in the 1980s. It's a company that has had a rough go of it lately. It started when they missed their earnings marked for the fourth quarter, and the very next day, the CEO of the company was pulled over for a DUI, and that has sort of spawned a ton of coverage of the issues this company is facing. And the latest development, they have apparently dropped the poison pill that was in their shareholder rights agreement, which is going to open the door for a possible takeover. But most of the folks that have been talking about this story, they've been talking about the DUI, and specifically, Jen, the dash cam video, and they've wanted to know, where is the body cam? Why can't we hear the conversation between the CEO and the arresting officers, Jen?
Well, because by South Carolina law, body cams are not subject to FOIA. Sometimes we request them and we get them back, but it's not mandatory for police departments to give us body camera footage, which is unfortunate.
And it really is. And I don't know, folks who watched the presidential race, the Republican presidential primary, Nikki Haley of South Carolina, obviously one of the candidates in that race, didn't do very well. But she is the one who signed a body cam law when she was governor of South Carolina several years ago. And yet the law, as we're just discussing now, doesn't compel the production of this key evidentiary tool. And a couple of years back in Florence, South Carolina, Jen, there was an officer-involved shooting. It was a captured on body-worn camera, and the Florence Sheriff's Office released this footage in connection with the investigation. And so at the time, we wrote a big column saying, hey, this is great. This needs to be standard operating procedure. I mean, Jen, isn't body-worn camera, that's a public document?
To me, it is. And and we do get, when we get dash cam videos, they do redact part of, they will redact if there's phone numbers or, birth dates. They can redact that stuff. So yeah, no, I really think that I personally cannot see a negative to those being released. All
right. And obviously in high profile cases, eventually they're going to come out, because if there's, cases under dispute, cases that get litigated. But it really ought to be, once we redact that sensitive information, it ought to be standard operating procedure. So I want everybody who's following not only that Blackbaud case, but all of these cases that we cover involving body-worn camera, we ask for it every time. We ask for it every time. And again, right now, governments in South Carolina are able to deny those requests, but we're going to keep pushing to expand the transparency on that law, because again, this is core to what government ought to do. Ought to be open, ought to be accountable. We can't have openness without that footage, and we can't have accountability unless we're able to see what it shows. So
exactly.
But Jen, the next case that we're going to talk about is one that you've done a ton of work on. It's a case that was actually the trial of the century in South Carolina before the Murdaugh case. It was the trial of the 20th century, and we're referring, of course, to the case of Susan Smith. And I was on the Presumption podcast the other day with Sarah Azari and Jim Griffin. And this is a case that they're starting to focus on, a case that you have interviewed the lead prosecutor. He's the current Speaker Pro Tem in the South Carolina House, Tommy Pope. But back in the mid-1990s, he was the solicitor for York County and Union County. And Union County, obviously, where this tragedy unfolded. Jen, walk us through the story of Susan Smith.
So Susan Smith, in, I believe it was 1994, she lived in Union County. She reported to the police that she had been carjacked at a traffic light, and the carjacker dropped her off and took off with her children. And for 2 weeks, police were, it was national media. Police were looking for these kids. Eventually she confessed that she had intended to commit suicide, according to her, and drove the kids into John B. Long Lake and in the car and strapped in their car seats. It was, I remember, I was in high school at that point, but I do remember following that case very closely.
Well, you spoke with, again, solicitor, now Speaker Pro Tem Tommy Pope, and he had some pretty jarring memories about that case. And tell us, there's one about, he talked about the time from when the car went in the lake. Tell us a little bit about that, Jen.
So yeah, I think this is one of the cases. He's most known for his handling of this case, and he really, he was very open about the entire prosecution from when she made that confession to when they pulled that car out of the lake with the kids still trapped in the car seat. And she had, she said, I was going to commit suicide and I jumped out and the car rolled ahead. And he said, as part of the prosecution, they took the exact same car and put it into the lake so they could reenact the car sinking. And he said it took 6 minutes for that car to sink. 6 minutes. And he said, when Susan called the police and the police arrived, she didn't have a drop of water on her. She wasn't even damp. So she made no attempt to get in. I mean, if that was one of my kids, well, I mean, I can't even imagine. 6 minutes.
Yeah. And then, of course, we heard about the divers from the State Department of Natural Resources who talked about the discovery of that vehicle under the water and seeing the tiny hands of these two boys through the window, one of them 3 years old, one of them only 14 months old.
And yeah, I mean, he said it was heartbreaking. He said, they're strapped into their car seats, the one thing that's meant to keep them safe, and they're still strapped into those car seats when they're pulling the car out of the water. I mean, it was a really, really sad case. I thought it was interesting because he said to me that, despite the fact that she was ultimately found guilty of murdering her two sons, he considers that to be a loss because he had wanted the death penalty. And the jury ultimately decided not to give her the death penalty and to give her life in prison. And he said, to him, everybody thought he was, bloodthirsty. He just, wanted the death penalty. But he said when he pulled back the lens and he looked at the case, he said if she had been carjacked by a black man and the black man had killed her kids, he would seek the death penalty. Right. It would be, he said, or if the father had done it, everybody would have been like, they need the death penalty. And he said, to him, it was a no-brainer. He said it wasn't about that. It was about equal justice. And he felt very strongly that that's what she deserved.
Indeed. And obviously Susan Smith had a difficult life. There were sexual assault allegations involving a stepfather who at the time was a very prominent member of the Republican Party, a prominent member of the Christian Coalition also. And so she'd gone through a lot. Obviously, no one's going to, completely dismiss that. And I think that's probably why she ultimately was spared the death penalty. But still, just the details of that crime are horrific. And in fact, Katie, one of our commenters here, was asking from the website about, the two innocent babies that died, and that she's shocked that she's even eligible for parole. And now, Jen, this is something the sentencing system in South Carolina changed in 2001, I believe it was. And so now she would not be eligible.
Right. Life means life. But back then, when she was sentenced, it wasn't, that's not how the sentencing guidelines work. So she is actually eligible for parole for the first time this November.
Right. That's going to happen. Yeah.
I mean,
November 2024.
I don't think she's going to get parole. I mean, it's not like she's had a stellar prison career. She's, I mean, there's been a lot of controversy with her while she's been in prison. And, it looks like recently she's kind of, she's taken a lot of classes that are offered by the corrections department. But it's been recently as the parole approaches, and she's got, a number of violations on her SCDC record. There's been a lot of talk about her having conversations with men outside of prison. That
it hadn't been just talk. She's been having them.
Yeah.
She's been having a lot of explicit conversations and had sex with at least 2 guards that we know of. There's allegations of relations with a bunch of different inmates. In fact, on that Presumption podcast, Jim Griffin made a very interesting comment about those. We won't get into that. Watch that episode if you haven't seen it. But
here's let Jim make a comment.
right. I'm going to let Jim get in trouble for that. But Sheila Turman has an interesting comment, talks about were Susan Smith to be released. She said, I think she would have a very hard time being out in public. The average person who remembers her crime will probably make her life a living hell. She needs to think about all this before asking for parole.
That's a really good point. And I did talk to Tommy Pope about the parole hearing and if he would be attending, because, you know, as the prosecutor, he does have the right to attend. And he was non-committal about it, but he did say something towards the end that made me think that he was planning to attend, just the way he phrased it. So it wouldn't be surprising to me if he did show up to, you know, at the very least support, you know, the father of those two boys.
No, absolutely. And I'm with you. I don't think there's a snowball's chance that Susan Smith is released, not just for her record since she's been incarcerated, but again, the heartbreaking nature of this crime. And again, we live in a society, I understand that we live in a society where the value of life is not as respected as it should be, as it perhaps once was. But this is one of those crimes that I just don't see any way she is allowed.
And it's interesting because there's two things that are interesting. We were talking about the police and how Tommy was kind of, you know, working. The police were working. It wasn't in his favor because the family was so connected to investigators. Like the sheriff at the time was her godfather. You know, just like he said, so usually when you put police on the stand, you know, you've got a testimony that's going to be positive and in your favor. And he said he wasn't getting that from the police at the time, which it was kind of, you know, early indications of Murdaugh, you know, just very, you know, just a small community with a lot of powerful people in play.
Indeed. Well, judging by the comments coming through on the YouTube thread, our audience clearly overwhelmingly opposed to the notion of Susan Smith being allowed to breathe free air again. Jen, I want to pivot. Obviously, we got a ton to talk about on this show. We got still our Murdaugh segment that we got to get to in a minute. But I want to pivot to another case that started in South Carolina, that apparently started with another failure of South Carolina's justice system to hold violent criminals accountable. We've written about that so many times. Again, it's like a broken record. I need to find a record machine one day here and take a bat to it the way we drone on about it. But it's important. It matters. We are having some impact on the judicial reform process. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But the case of Jeremy Smith of Marion, South Carolina, this is a guy with a lengthy record. He is suspected to have carjacked or some other way absconded with a white BMW owned by a first responder out of Florence, South Carolina, whose body was discovered shortly thereafter in Dillon County with a gunshot wound to the head. He travels across the country to New Mexico. His car has a flat tire on an interstate highway in New Mexico. State trooper pulls up behind, offers to give him a lift into town to get the vehicle fixed. He proceeds to shoot the trooper, killing him, drive off in the vehicle, and send the New Mexico police and the various law enforcement agencies around Albuquerque, New Mexico, on a manhunt. Jeremy Smith was captured. Bernalillo County Sheriff's deputies, I believe 2 days after the shooting incident. But Jen, walk us through a little bit. This guy has got a lot of charges in South Carolina, doesn't he?
Yeah, he had quite the criminal history, from robbery, burglary. But while he was in jail awaiting trial, he escaped. So he assaulted a prison guard. He got out of jail. He escaped. He was on the run. They recaptured him. And this was all, you know, it wasn't like it was 30 years ago. We're talking like within the past 10 years. Yeah. So despite, you know, he was charged for all of those crimes, went to prison, SCDC, and was released in, I believe it was December 1st of last year.
Yeah, 3 months ago.
Yeah, his crime spree started 3 months after.
And he was supposed, here's the thing, we hear about this, we heard about this in the Bowen Smith case, the accused teen rapist that has been the poster boy for judicial leniency here in South Carolina. We talked about it in his case, but this, quote, active supervision from our justice system once these violent criminals, who again have no business being back on our streets, once they're released, we place them under this so-called active supervision. Well, Jeremy Smith was under that. He was supposed to be reporting to the probation office there in Marion County, or I'm sorry, rather Marlborough County was apparently where he was on probation, but he was still on probation at the time this crime spree was undertaken. I got a great comment here from Tamara Rhodes. Stay on this story and find out why this thug was not locked up. And absolutely, Tamara, we're going to do that. I do have
a lot of FOIAs out on that for all of the incident reports and records and SCDC records to, figure out what his time in prison was like, if he was the model prisoner or if he was a problem child, which we'll see what comes back.
Yeah. And once again, the problem is that in so many cases, this is the rule, not the exception. This is a problem that continues to perpetuate itself, and it doesn't always end up in murders, but we keep seeing, again, the same violent criminals come before the same judges in South Carolina. We keep getting the same outcomes, which again, not only is that deleterious to public safety, it's a slap in the face to the victims. Again, it just makes a mockery of this entire system, but we have been pushing, obviously, for judicial reform here in the Palmetto State for many years. We are seeing a little bit of progress on that, Jen. And I wanted to bring Dylan Nolan in here. Dylan, you've been covering this issue a lot over at the State House. Wanted to get Dylan to hop in the call here so we can get his perspective on this. But while he's coming on, one question that a reader sent in, I found this very interesting, talking about how to get at the corrosive, corrupt influence of some of these powerful lawmakers. And the question was, do you think South Carolina would ever pay a decent salary to state lawmakers and then prohibit them from jobs that have conflicts of interest? And I'm glad they raised this, because back in 2017, I wrote a column calling for precisely that. Currently, lawmakers in South Carolina, they pay a part-time salary, barely $20,000. I think it's maybe even under $15,000. But I said, look, let's go ahead and pay them $80,000 a year. But when you get that salary, you are not allowed to take any money anywhere else, particularly money that involves public funds, public contracts. So anyway, Dylan, you're on with us now. Walk us through a little bit, Dylan, about where we are on the judicial reform issue here in South Carolina.
Yeah, sure. First, I would like to address what you were just talking about as far as the compensation goes. I think it's very interesting, and it ties in with the attorneys in the legislature being granted privilege of not having to appear in court while they're in session. And that's why we see a disproportionately large amount of attorneys in our legislature compared to folks in other professions, which I think is the root of many of the legislatively generated problems in South Carolina, such as the completely mixed up tort law, which comes from the interests of trial attorneys being put over the interests of businesses or other key constituencies, such as just regular people that should be represented. But if you're somebody who manages a business, obviously the people with whom you do commerce aren't going to say, oh, well, you're in the General Assembly, you don't have to show up to these meetings for half of the year. So yes, paying members of the General Assembly an amount of money that they could actually feasibly live on, and I think ending the privilege for attorneys, and I get it, I've spoken with numerous attorneys who are legislators, and I understand their perspective that they're doing a service to the state, but that doesn't mean that there aren't literally millions of other people who could be doing service to the state in representing the interest of people who live here without having that special privilege that allows people of a certain profession who have a habit of writing laws that are beneficial to other members of that profession from being the only people with a competitive advantage as far as being able to make their money and still serve in the General Assembly.
And the problem is they leverage that legislative immunity. They use it to get clients and delay their cases. If somebody's out on bond, what do they care if their case takes 5 years to get in front of a judge? I mean, it's and they know that. They say, I'll invoke my legislative immunity and we'll keep this, It's very frustrating, and the dockets get backed up in the courts, and it's not. It's frustrating.
Yeah, it's obviously the angle I was coming at it from was what kind of people end up in the General Assembly, and that's an angle in and of itself. But the angle you mentioned was one that was really brought to my attention by Jack Swerling, who's one of these state's most esteemed defense attorneys. He represented Pee Wee Gaskins back in the day when he was a public defender. He's represented a number of high-profile clients and gotten people off who most defense attorneys would have no chance of doing. The point being, he, above probably any other defense attorney in the state, should have a pretty easy job getting clients, but he was talking about people coming into his office and saying, well, XYZ lawyer legislator can do things like keep my case out of court for half a year. And if you're somebody who might be going away for the rest of your life, that half a year is going to literally be worth everything to you.
We've got a comment here from Jim Lamb. This came through on our Facebook page. He was asking about judicial reform, and he made the comment, real judicial reform, not as long as lawyers are involved in seating judges. And Jim, I hate to say it, but the reform bills that are currently under discussion in the South Carolina General Assembly do not take lawyer legislators off of that powerful screening committee that basically picks the judges. Obviously, they go for a legislative election after they're screened out, but it's basically that commission, the Judicial Merit Selection Commission, that picks the judges. And right now it is dominated by lawyer legislators. There were efforts, particularly in the state Senate, to take lawyer legislators off of it. Those efforts have come up short. And so once again, we're in a situation where the people who are picking the judges are turning around, appearing in front of them, and getting these violent offenders off the hook.
And we're one of the only 2 states that chooses their judges this way. Somebody had just asked that on Peppermint asked that on YouTube. We're one of only 2 states who chooses their judges this way.
That's right. Virginia's the other state, but to their credit, Virginia at least has a screening process that isn't completely dominated by lawyer legislators. And so I would argue our system is the worst in the country. Now, again, I don't want to dog out all the judges in South Carolina. We have judges that do the right thing. Our website credits them and praises them when they do. But again, there's just too many examples of, again, habitually violent criminals being habitually granted leniency when they shouldn't. And we see the consequences. But arguably the most egregious instance of our justice system, corruption at the institutional level, the Murdaugh saga. And we're going to talk about that now. Jen Wood, Dylan, you're going to be down in Charleston this coming
Monday,
week, April 1st, Monday, for the federal sentencing hearing of Alec Murdaugh. Let's start there. Some fireworks. Just this past week, federal prosecutors and Murdaugh's attorneys taking some shots back and forth at each other. Jen, let's start with you on those latest filings in the Murdaugh saga.
So, yeah, I mean, it was the sentencing's Monday, and it has been quiet in Murdaugh land for a few weeks, which has been nice. But, as this shouldn't have surprised us, Tuesday, federal prosecutors filed a motion to hold Alex Murdaugh in breach of his plea agreement, stating that he failed a polygraph examination that was given to him to determine where an additional $6 million from victims has been hidden.
This is the missing money we've been chasing for so long.
Right, as well as the involvement of another attorney. So that really got people speculating, and I do have an article that should be coming out soon about who that other attorney could be.
Well, let's go ahead. Let's break it here for the YouTube audience, because we talked about this, Jen, you'll remember, my first theory was that the pleading was referencing Corey Fleming, who obviously a Beaufort, South Carolina attorney, one of Alec Murdaugh's closest friends, who was involved in a lot of these fleecings with Russell Lafitte, the disgraced banker, who's also been federally convicted. So that was my first guess. But Jen, we're hearing it's not Corey Fleming that they were referring to.
It is Chris Wilson.
Oh, wow.
That's what our sources are saying. Chris Wilson, who, according to the trial, Alex said he shit him up real bad, Bo.
Yeah, that's some Southern vernacular for those of you unfamiliar with the term. One of the many terms made famous during that Murdaugh double homicide trial. But Jen, Chris Wilson, we and this isn't just speculation that we're hearing from sources close to the federal process. We're hearing from folks that are close to Chris Wilson.
Yes.
He apparently, feds, when they filed that document, apparently he immediately knew that's who they were talking about. What is the potential exposure here? What do they think Alec Murdaugh lied about related to Chris Wilson?
I mean, they're all really good questions. The prosecutors also filed a motion to seal the exhibits that went along with that motion to hold him in breach of his plea agreement. So they don't want people to know because there's an ongoing grand jury investigation. There are witnesses or other potential criminal charges coming. So, it has been sealed. But, Chris Wilson, Corey Fleming, and Alex Murdaugh have been close for decades. They went to law school together. They graduated. I don't know. I mean, I know Corey and Alex graduated the same year. I'm not sure if Chris did as well. But they for decades have been close. And the money on a lawsuit that Chris Wilson was co-counseling with Alex is really what they believe set Alex's crime spree relating to the murder and the roadside shooting into play. So they had this settlement. Chris Wilson had the funds dispersed to his law firm's account, and Alex told Chris to write the check directly to him instead of to PMPED. So $792 in attorney fees that should have gone to PMPED. And Jeannie Seckinger on June 7th, the day 2021, the day Maggie and Paul were murdered, she was asking Alex about that money. And Chris Wilson, he got a check back to him, but not all of it got to the PMPED account. But that money is really plays a big role in the motive, what the state believes to be the motive of Alex Murdaugh in killing his wife and son.
But Jen, I got to ask you this. During the trial, Chris Wilson was a victim. Chris Wilson was someone who was presented not only in the in-camera stuff on the financial crimes, but he was somebody who was a victim of Alec Murdaugh. Now the feds, it seems, are saying, well, wait a minute, not so fast.
Maybe Chris Wilson knew a little more than he was letting on. And it's funny because there are a lot of people like Chris Wilson. Chris Wilson was one of the big ones that I remember thinking this, where, as people were watching this trial in real time and getting up to speed on the case, people really felt bad for him. He seemed very brokenhearted, but he's one of those people where I was watching him and I was thinking, you're an attorney. You knew better. You knew better than to write a check to an attorney and not the firm he works for.
So we had a hint a few weeks ago. I think you put it, or actually it was Callie Lyons, our researcher reporter. Callie Lyons filed a story which had a nugget in it kind of toward the end. You always got to read to the end of the stories, folks. That's where the good stuff is. It's like the footnotes in a filing. But Callie had a reference to the fact that Judge Richard Gergel 2 weeks ago had indicated in a notice to Alec Murdaugh's attorneys that he was going to seek what's called an upward variance, a more severe sentence, or that he was going to consider it. Let's be clear, he wasn't going to impose it necessarily, but Murdaugh's attorneys clearly took this as an indication that their client was about to get a much more strict sentence, a much longer sentence, and perhaps even for Murdaugh, the word he's fearing is consecutive. The word consecutive. If we hear that federal sentence is consecutive, then all of a sudden this appeal of Murdaugh's murder convictions doesn't matter because he's in jail for the rest of his life. Is that right, Jen?
Right. And
May I
that's
weigh
what,
in here?
yeah,
Yeah, Dylan.
absolutely. Please.
So I had the pleasure of covering Russell Laffitte's trial, which was in front of Judge Gergel, and then I've also covered Corey Fleming's sentencing, which was in front of Judge Gergel. So, Corey's procedure is pretty similar to what I'm expected to see in court on Monday. However, one thing that I noted during my coverage of Fleming's sentencing was just how different Judge Gergel's courtroom is when the prosecutors, the defendant, and the judge are all on the same page. I mean, it was almost as if we were watching like Corey's going away party with how much attention was put on the statements submitted by Corey's family and how perfunctory the addresses of the victims who were in attendance were. And I'm glad that they showed up and made their voices heard, because otherwise the only parties there would have been folks on Fleming's side. Contrast that with Russell Laffitte's trial, and I still don't know why Russell went to trial, because they had him dead to rights, and so really he just put on hundreds of pages of documents and records that will exist forever, stuff that implicates many members of his family and criminality. But Gergel's courtroom, when you are not working with the prosecutors, is a scary place to be. So reading through Team Murdaugh's filings, when they don't have any carve-outs for if I fail a polygraph, a neutral third party comes in, I don't think that Judge Gergel is going to favorably interpret, their ask for this to not result in the revocation of the deal put forth by the government.
So you think that Murdaugh's plea deal is kaput?
I just, having seen the way that Gergel handled Laffitte and the way that he handled Fleming, if you know federal court, by the time you're in federal court, you're in deep trouble. They have like a 96, 97% conviction rate. So the idea that Alex has any leverage at this point is, where's his leverage?
Yeah. No,
I
agree.
did think, when I was reading through, so the defense, as part of the federal sentencing process, what happens is the prosecutors work with the Department of Parole, the Federal Department of Parole and Probation, to do a pre-sentencing report with recommendations on what the sentence should be. And then the defense team files a sentencing memorandum arguing for the lowest amount of time they can argue for. So what I was reading through was the defense's sentencing memorandum, where they're arguing for, lower charges for Alex. Good luck, dude. And the one thing that I did know, the one point that they had that I thought was really interesting was the timing of the federal prosecutors dropping that failed polygraph. They had the results of that polygraph in October of 2023, and they drop it 2 days before the sentencing hearing.
That is a great point, Jen.
I mean, come on. I mean, they even had it like they had the results go out and they were independently reviewed. They had those results back. So that's when they say that it wasn't in good faith. That was a big part of their argument was, we can't be expected to, they've had this since October.
And I'm not going to put my tinfoil hat on here, but I do want to point out that Judge Gergel and former Chief Justice Jean Toll, who overheard the jury tampering hearing 2 months ago, very close friends. And I say that, again, want to be perfectly clear. I think everybody on this call believes Alec Murdaugh's guilty as sin, not only on the financial crimes, but certainly being at the scene of these murders. If he didn't do it, he knows exactly who did and isn't saying, which again, at that point, that's your funeral, dude. But he's where he should be. Obviously, I'm of the opinion, this is one where I agree 100% with attorney Eric Bland, who has said he should never again breathe free air. I have no problem endorsing that perspective as well. But again, the process does matter here. Jen, let me ask you this, though, and Dylan, I want to get your thoughts on this, too, as we approach this hearing. When Monday's done, when we have a federal disposition on the charges against Alec Murdaugh, are we still going to be talking about the murder appeal as in any way being a practical thing, or are we going to be in a situation where that murder appeal it really doesn't matter because this guy's put away for life.
Are they still going to pursue the appeal?
Oh, absolutely. They're going to still pursue it.
All right.
I think the argument there is, hey, he may be locked up for the rest of his life, but he wants people to know he didn't do it. Although, again, I think, once again, something else the three of us can agree on, and probably the vast majority of our audience, is that if Alec Murdaugh gets a new trial, his odds of being found not guilty are not that great, particularly if the transcript from the first trial is able to be introduced. I mean,
right.
I don't know. This is, it feels like checkmate here, and it does sort of feel like this thing is winding down and that Alec Murdaugh and his attorneys are running out of options. Dylan, you agree?
I mean, especially if he's never going to see the light of day again, after Monday. I don't know exactly what is confirmed about who's paying his legal bills at this point in time, but I think that whoever's cutting those checks might be less incentivized to continue doing so, because this is very expensive to fight these fights.
Absolutely. We had an attorney who's very familiar with the federal process called yesterday and indicated, get a good look at Murdaugh on Monday. It's going to be the last time you see him for a while. So I want to pivot now. We've been talking about this Murdaugh case and the big developments in the federal side. But there were also some big developments in, I guess it's the spinoff saga of Becky Hill, the clerk of court in Colleton County, South Carolina. Becky Hill called a press conference this past week with her attorneys, and she resigned her office. Dylan Nolan, you were there. Tell us about the vibe of this press conference.
So I will just a couple of minutes of shop talk before Becky came out. It was just a little over a year after the Murdaugh trial verdict. So it was almost the exact same crowd of people, who spent 6 weeks together covering that story. And it was a bit of a reunion there for us media types. And there was a lot of reminiscing. I really enjoyed that portion. And it was very interesting because it felt like you were, waiting for a funeral to start, but you're there with a bunch of people that you like, so you're yucking it up. And there was, I'm sound checking, I'm getting our microphone set, and I'm just hearing people laughing and having a really good time. And I thought, oh, this is so odd for what's about to happen. Right on time, Becky walks out the door, followed by Justin Bamberg, and I would say like 6 court staff. And it was interesting to me that they chose to stand behind her. None of them spoke, so we didn't really get their perspective as to exactly what they were thinking. And they went back in the building after, so, we didn't really get much of their thoughts. But the thing that struck me was she almost seemed like, stepping down was taking a weight off of her shoulders just by her demeanor. I'm sure y'all watching that back, so that she had a smile on her face for what would, for me at least, be a press conference that you wouldn't see a smile on my face. But I can also understand how, getting out of this situation, at least in some way, could be light for her.
Well, we're going to break a little more news on this program, Jen, earlier, obviously, with the big bombshell about Chris Wilson being the lawyer referenced in the federal Murdaugh file. We're going to break a little more news about Becky Hill. Our sources close to the investigation have indicated that one of the areas that they are looking at, they obviously have done a deep dive into Becky Hill's use of county funds, of taxpayer funds. Now, the origin of this allegation was that she used taxpayer money in her position to write this book that made her not a whole lot of money, apparently, but some money, and that was the big ethical indiscretion. But we have since learned that the investment into the various accounts that Becky Hill had control over, apparently they have found several things. One of the things we are told, taxpayer money going to clean Becky Hill's house. This is one of the many things apparently that agents have uncovered. Also interesting to note, Dylan, not long after Becky Hill's press conference, her co-author on that book, Neil Gordon, came out and announced that he had been interviewed by the State Law Enforcement Division just days earlier, and that they had expressed, quote, a great deal of concern about Becky possibly using her office for personal gain. So again, the wall's really closing in on Becky Hill. Also of interest, one of the individuals who stood behind her is campaigning for her seat. So that could get quite interesting down there in Colleton County, which is, again, is where that Murdaugh trial of the century took place. Guys, as we close this show out, some thoughts on Becky Hill. Again, she's someone that we were all very close to during the trial, someone who had a reputation for, being very accommodating with the media, apparently too accommodating, it would seem. But she's somebody, no one really expected this to happen. And then obviously last September, that bolt out of the blue, the jury tampering allegations against her that were filed by Murdaugh's attorneys. Jen Wood, let's start with you. Where does Becky Hill go down in history?
It's interesting because when this all started breaking in September, when Dick and Jim had their press conference and filed their motion for a new trial, I remember thinking that this is insane. There's no way. There's absolutely not the Becky I knew. And as more and more information kept coming out, I think it was about the time in December when she announced that she had plagiarized parts of her book. It was the first time where I was like, I don't think the Becky I know is the real Becky. I think there's more to her. That press conference was very bizarre. I think everybody was expecting her to resign her position, and she was going on and on about, not seeking re-election. And even lawyer Lori she bowed out of the video early, like just thinking that she was just not announcing she wasn't going to run for re-election. And at the very end, and I'm resigning effective immediately. It was like, boom. I think the scope of the investigation into Becky is broad. I think from what I'm hearing, SLED is doing a lot of work on that.
Indeed. No, that's absolutely right. Dylan, your thoughts, Becky Hill, how does she remembered?
In every interaction that I had with Becky on a personal level, I would have nothing bad to say at all. I mean, you remember they were having problems getting a television rigged up in the courtroom so that people in the gallery could see the exhibits. And I literally brought my personal gear table, like a felted gear table in there, and helped her and one of the county people set it up. You don't think you're just helping out. You're just doing what's right. And I think that that's a lot of what she thought that she was doing. At least that's how it appeared to me outwardly. But like Jennifer says, with the plagiarism, that speaks to one's character deeply. And that kind of stuff really disturbed me, but also things that indicate that she, as an officer of the court, willingly and knowingly violated court orders that's just absurd to me. So there's just things that you can't do if you want to hold a high trust position in society, like the one that she ran for, was elected to, and the office that she held. You have to take those responsibilities seriously if you want to be in a position of trust like that. And it's clear to me that she didn't. And while I don't have a bad word to say about her personally, those professional failings could easily make all these victims have to come back and recount, all those horrors and cost the taxpayers millions of dollars to rerun this trial. It's definitely not a given at this point that her actions won't result in that. And Will, I'd like to just give you kudos. When you read her book and interviewed her, your first question was about her insights with the jurors. And that's an interview question that I've come back and watched dozens of times since this whole thing went south. And I'd just like to give you a hat tip to your nose for news and your ability to read through that book and pick out what really needed to be discussed.
Well, we've got a ton more Murdaugh books coming down the pike. I know, Jen, you've already been looking at Jason Ryan's book. Yeah. I think we're going to hear some news on Valerie Borline's big books.
And both of them actually know how to write.
No, the Jason Ryan book, I read it cover to cover. I'm reading it again. It was amazing. He's an amazing writer in the first place.
Incredibly intelligent.
Yeah, I mean, it was very good. If you're interested in the history and, the current Murdaugh debacle, he weaves them together perfectly. It was very good. Highly recommend.
And Val's book, I have no doubt, is going to be great. She's been putting in a lot of research and work on this book, so I can't wait to see what angles she brings to the public light that have not been explored yet.
Absolutely. And one comment here on Becky Hill that we're reading from Veritas, obviously Latin for truth, and they wrote, "Fame took Rebecca Hill down." I think that lives up to the Veritas
even
name there.
Looking at that press conference, I was thinking, why is this a press? This is just a press release. Who did she want that? It was. Just.
I'd like to give a example of a clerk of court who shows the same level of Southern hospitality as Becky Hill, but is completely morally upright from everything I know, and that's the clerk of court in Kingstree. Unfortunately, I don't remember her name, but a couple of months ago, I left an audio recorder in Kingstree, which is not near Columbia, where we're based out of. So, and I get an email the next day, and it wasn't labeled with our news outlet or anything. She just remembered me putting it there, I guess, and found my email, emailed me, and sent it back to us. This is just like an example of the kind of Southern hospitality kind of things that Becky would do for you. Unfortunately, it was coupled with all this stuff, which has become absolute, nightmare for her and for the trial team that put Alex behind bars. But that kind of character in public servants is something that, if you interact with courts, it's so appreciated. So I don't want us, saying bad things about Becky's shortcomings to be any repudiation of people in her position acting, the good parts of her character.
True, and there are a lot of good clerks out there. And by the way, Kingstree, that's the home seat of Judge Clifton Newman. In fact, if you go in that courtroom, we're actually in that courtroom watching him preside under his own portrait. And
Peppermint here says she probably didn't want to be remembered, which is the point of a clerk of court. A clerk of court is like a machine that makes the court run. They're not a personality. In no other legal proceeding that I've covered have I had more than 5 interactions with the clerk of court, just asking about, am I allowed to take pictures here? Can I publish this? Those kinds of questions. Is court going to resume at 10 like it did yesterday? So that, that's why you might not know them on a first name basis and have them in your cell phone, because they're somebody who's a functionary within the court who's obviously invaluable to that court operating, but them and their personality is typically not something that makes its way into the proceedings at all, because it's not supposed to. You're not supposed to have the stenographer's name be in the headlines either.
That's true. Well, obviously, folks, we have been covering this Becky Hill saga from the beginning. Our media outlet, the first to report on the ethics charges against her, the first to report on the criminal investigation into her. And obviously, we would be keeping incredibly close tabs on her story as it continues to unfold. But one thing is sure, Becky Hill, unlikely to be remembered the way that I think she would have wanted to be remembered in her memoir. And in fact, we had a funny comment from Aaron in the chat about the memoir, who said, based on the plagiarism allegations, Becky should have just used ChatGPT to write it. But we will keep an eye on this case. Obviously, Dylan will be in Charleston on Monday for Alec Murdaugh's federal sentencing hearing. We will bring you updates on that. On Monday.
We can't video that, just to make sure people are aware of that. But Dylan really does a great job on Twitter doing live feeds and keeping us updated. So if you're following us, make sure you look at Twitter and we'll get the article up.
Absolutely. And just want to thank everybody for tuning in. This was the first time we've done this, the first ever month in review. We will be doing this once a month moving forward. Same format, where we will send out in advance a survey to not only get your input on the topics that we talk about, but also to get your questions and your comments on these stories that we're covering. I want to thank Jen Wood for her work on so many of these stories. I want to thank Dylan Nolan for his work on the stories and for putting this entire thing together. Dylan, folks don't always know, not only is he on-air talent, on-camera talent, but he's the one that puts it all together behind the scenes. So
I'm a nerd too. And y'all, I'm going to be looking at these comments. So if there's anything that you would like to see us improve for next month, as far as the technical side of this, or even just how we're running the show, please leave it in the comments. We're going to be taking it into consideration as we plan our next episode.
Indeed. We'll catch you guys next time on Your Month in Review.